Our main story this week focuses on the Syrian refugee crisis. The flow of humanity fleeing from Syria with little but the clothes on their back, millions of Syrians have fled since 2011, is a crisis so big and with so many moving parts that cries like this one have mostly fallen on deaf ears.
Imagine yourself in our place. You are a human. We are a human. You have kids. We have kids.
That is, until that picture surfaced. Seeing it seemed to strike a global nerve and had some wondering if a picture this powerful could change things. That this would have to change, that it would have to stop. If only the world could agree on what this and it actually are. Like nearly everyone who has seen it, I found the photos of 3-year-old Aylan waterlogged and dead on a beach in Greece completely devastating. The scope of the crisis, being as large it is, makes it difficult to take in. Identifying with an image of a 3-year-old drowned on a beach is a matter that is much more immediate. Now, for some, the tragedy begins and ends as a familial one. A father, tragically, is able to honor his son's last words to him. "Daddy, please don't drown," are the last words reportedly uttered by Aylan, even as he is unable to save the boy who made the plea, his brother, and his wife. Now, if you're a parent, seeing Aylan on the beach and being carried off by a police officer, it's hard not to imagine your own children in the same circumstance.
Is there someone whose children are not valuable to them? The children enrapture you. They wake up in the morning. "Daddy, I want to play in the water." Is there anything in the world better than this? Everything is gone.
For others, the tragedy is a deeper one because we somehow feel that it could have been avoided if only those to blame would have acted differently. But who or what is to blame? Some would say the blame lies with the smuggler who, trying to tap into what has become a business worth billions, growing even larger than the illicit trade in drugs and weapons, took unnecessary risks just to make some money. Others still can blame climate change for the crisis, as Erin Baker, writing for Time magazine, reminds us, quote, "From 2006 to 2011, large swaths of Syria suffered from an extreme drought that, according to climatologists, was exacerbated by climate change. The drought led to an increased poverty and relocation in urban areas, according to a recent report by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and cited by Scientific American. That drought, in addition to its mismanagement by the Assad regime, contributed to the displacement of 2 million in Syria," says Francisco Femia of the Washington, D.C.-based Center for Climate and Security. Quote, "That internal displacement may have contributed to the social unrest that precipitated the civil war, which generated the refugee flows into Europe. And what happened in Syria," he says, "is likely to play out elsewhere going forward." Indeed, as Jeff Biggers wrote in Common Dreams, quote, "Nearly 60 million people fled their homes in 2014. Within a generation, according to estimates by numerous climate scientists and the international organizations dealing with migration, 150 to 200 million people could be displaced by the fallout of severe drought, flooding, and extreme climate." That is a lot of potential humanity washing up on an ever-shifting coastline. If only there was a leader on the world stage who can lead us out from the albatross that is the profit-fueled denial we suffer under into a cleaner, greener, safer future.
Alaskans are on the front lines of one of the greatest challenges we face this century: climate change. You see, climate change once seemed like a problem for future generations, but for most Americans, it's already a reality. Deeper droughts, longer wildfire seasons, some of our cities even flood at high tide. It's our wake-up call. The alarm bells are ringing. And as long as I'm president, America will lead the world to meet this threat before it's too late.
Listening to Obama speak right there, I'm full of hope, kinda. I'm full of it. I'm full of hope for the possibility of real change in the world. I'm fired up, ready to go. But then about an hour later, I feel empty again. Obama is like Chinese food that way. You crave it. You want the spring roll, you want the scallion pancakes and the deep-fried tofu. You devour it, you feel full. But about an hour later, you're starving again because you read the fortune cookie that says, "And all the above energy policy is the path to economic growth, but it's also flooding, extreme weather, drought. Proceed with caution." There it is again, economic growth, a demand of capitalism trumping
horrible Hispanics, crime, and all the anchor babies.
Not you, Donald. Economic growth taking priority over the climate catastrophe that has already making parts of the world look like a Mad Max movie. Others still would blame Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and surely al-Assad should shoulder much of the blame. As climate change drove more and more Syrians into urban centers, those urban centers became the site of horrific destruction, as Assad bombed areas where insurgent rebels, terrorists, or what he calls those seeking to oust him in the country's civil war, are located. And Assad, unsurprisingly for his part, blames the West. He blames us.
Made the point that the United States had been willfully blind to the efforts that the Syrian government had made in battling ISIS on the ground, and there's been no coordination whatsoever, he said, between the United States-led coalition and the Syrian government when it comes to fighting ISIS.
The question is not about whether Europe is taking refugees or not, but about the necessity to remove the prime cause of the issue. If Europeans are concerned with the fate of the refugees, they should stop supporting terrorists. This is our opinion on the problem. This is the essence of the whole refugee issue.
And what of that? We noted that in 2006, Syria started to experience extreme drought, which contributed to poverty and in turn contributed to the migrant crisis. Was anything else, I wonder, brewing back in 2006?
Our Syria chapter goes back to 2006. There's a very important cable in 2006 from Ambassador Roebuck, stationed in Damascus. And he writes back discussing a plan for the overthrow of the Assad government in Syria. And that plan is not, well, we should, support the opposition and so on through better media planning and so on. It's to use a number of different factors to create paranoia within the Syrian government, to push it to overreact, to make it fear that there's a coup, to use its maneuvers against Islamic extremists against it. So when Syria says we have a problem with Islamic extremists crossing over the border with Iraq and we're taking actions against them, to take this information and make the Syrian government look weak, the fact that it is dealing with Islamic extremists at all. And then, most seriously, to foster tensions between Shiites and Sunnis. In particular, take rumours which they know to be false, and say in the cable they know to be false or exaggerations, and promote them, that Iran is trying to convert poor Sunnis, and to work with Saudi and Egypt to foster that perception in order to make it harder for Iran to have influence and also harder for the government to have influence in the population.
In fact, collapsing Syria has been a U.S. foreign policy objective since the days after the Twin Towers fell. General Wesley Clark has been telling anyone who will listen about a day he visited the Pentagon in the wake of 9/11 and heard about classified plans that were in place to take out 7 governments.
And by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, it's worse than that. He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
And sure enough, according to a June 2012 New York Times article, quote, a small number of CIA officers are operating in Turkey secretly, helping allies decide which Syrian opposition fighters across the border will receive arms to fight the Syrian government. In that context, the narrative expressed by Minar Mahawish, writing at Mint Press News, makes sense. Quote, foreign powers have sunk Syria into a nightmare combination of civil war, foreign invasion, and terrorism. Syrians are in the impossible position of having to choose between living in a war zone, being treated by groups like ISIS and the Syrian government's brutal crackdown, or faring dangerous waters with minimal safety equipment, only to be denied food, water, and safety by European governments if they reach shore.
Imagine yourself in our place. You are a human. We are a human. You have kids. We have kids.
The United States had a chance, as some war hawks, even those who possess peace prizes preemptively, would frame it, of going to war with Syria over the use, allegedly, of chemical weapons.
10 days ago, the world watched in horror as men, women, and children were massacred in Syria in the worst chemical weapons attack of the 21st century. Yesterday, the United States presented a powerful case that the Syrian government was responsible for this attack on its own people. Our intelligence shows the Assad regime and its forces preparing to use chemical weapons, launching rockets in the highly populated suburbs of Damascus, and acknowledging that a chemical weapons attack took place.
Now, the assertion that the Syrian government was responsible for gassing their own people to death doesn't carry with it the benefit of being a verifiable fact. However, verifiable facts have never stood in the way of the United States military machine, and so Obama made clear in the summer of 2013 that his administration, while seeking congressional approval for military action, didn't really need that approval to go to war. To check off one of the 7 countries from the list of countries whose regimes we were hell-bent on changing. And so Obama made clear that while prepared to give Congress a voice, he was also prepared to continue in a long-standing presidential prerogative to flout international law and the Constitution and go to war with Syria with or without congressional approval. An overwhelming outcry from activists pressured Congress, and that pressure actually worked. We didn't go to war with Syria. In September of 2013, I spoke with Medea Benjamin of Code Pink about the victory for a suddenly resurgent anti-war movement here in the United States.
I've never felt prouder of the American people, really.
When you're talking to members of Congress, do you get a consensus about why there's an opposition? Do they believe the presentation by the Obama administration that Assad is responsible for the chemical attacks and just don't want to attack, or do they question that assessment as well?
I think for the first time, they really were listening to their constituents. I think that was the number one thing. It was amazing, Dennis, going into the offices because the phones were ringing off the hook, but you never knew what kind of people were calling in. It wasn't just that the peace movement revived itself, which it did. It was the heartland spoke up.
Now, if you're still among those who think that the United States invading Syria would have helped to mitigate the humanitarian crisis we're looking at now, perhaps you'll consider a counterpoint supported by the last 70 years of the United States military interventions of the overt and covert variety that succeeded only in solidifying our access to energy resources and failed miserably in the area of decreasing human suffering. Not that that was ever their objective. And even if Obama could not find a politically expedient path to a traditional invasion, a clandestine effort by the U.S. against Syria and Iran with the objective of toppling the leadership in those countries goes back to at least 2007, as has been widely reported by Seymour Hersh in The New Yorker. And so you will not be surprised to note, it never was about chemical weapons, it was about the oil. As reported in The Guardian in August of 2013, massacres of civilians are being exploited for narrow geopolitical competition to control Mideast oil. Quote, in 2009, the same year French Foreign Minister Dumas alleged the British began planning operations in Syria, Assad refused to sign a proposed agreement with Qatar that would have run a pipeline from the latter's north field, contiguous with Iran's south Pars field, through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, and on to Turkey, with a view to supply European markets, albeit bypassing Russia. Assad's rationale was to protect the interests of his Russian ally, which is Europe's top supplier of natural gas. Instead, the following year, Assad pursued negotiations for an alternative $10 billion pipeline with Iran across Syria that would also potentially allow Iran to supply gas to Europe. The Memorandum of Understanding for the project was signed in July of 2012, just as Syria's civil war was spreading to Damascus and Aleppo. And in 2013, Iraq signed a framework for agreement for construction of those gas pipelines. So there you have it. Putin and al-Assad want a pipeline to take a path economically befitting them. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and others want a pipeline to take a path economically befitting to them. And so a 3-year-old drowned dead boy on a beach, one story in literally millions of stories of people desperately fleeing their home, is all about some geopolitical bullies wanting to make some money. The human imagination, capable of building the pyramids, capable of delivering humans to the moon, capable of storing everything that once occupied library stacks in a freaking cloud, that human imagination can't solve this humanitarian crisis? Slavov Zijeck, writing for In These Times, states, quote, "The most difficult and important task is a radical economic change that should abolish social conditions that create refugees. The ultimate cause of refugees is today's global capitalism itself and its geopolitical games. And if we do not transform it radically, immigrants from Greece and other European countries will soon join African refugees. When I was young, such an attempt to organize to regulate commons was called communism. Maybe we should reinvent it. Maybe this is, in the long term, our only solution." I don't think communism should replace capitalism when it crumbles. And yes, it is crumbling. The term communism has too much negative baggage. But the system we have now will continue to deliver more and more Aylans until we can bring it down and replace it. We have decades of geopolitical engineering by the American empire to overcome. Is our collective imagination up to the task? Because this has to stop. It has to change.
Imagine yourself in our place. You are a human. We are a human. You have kids. We have kids.